Good evening and welcome. My name is Lorelei Muniz, and I am with Littlefield Action for Social Justice, also known as LA4SJ. We are a group within Littlefield Presbyterian Church in Dearborn, Michigan, that is committed to confronting structural racism and systemic poverty in our communities through awareness, reflection, and purposeful action. As we begin, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, which include the Meskwaki, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa peoples, and also acknowledge the resilience and diversity of the local Indigenous community that resides here today. About 200 Native American residents currently live in Dearborn, and about 3,000 in Detroit. Indigenous wisdom has a lot to offer us as we look to repair our relationships with each other and the land. For tonight's community conversation, we are honored to have Dr. Ron Stockton with us to discuss Dearborn Mayor Orville Hubbard's legacy of good governance and bad racism. Our program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, and it's being streamed live on Facebook. Ron will speak to us for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience for the last 20 minutes of the hour. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can submit your question in the chat at any time. If you are live with us on Facebook, you can submit a question in the comments. My colleague Anna Dewey will be collecting the questions and presenting them to Ron during the Q&A. We value your participation and encourage your questions. Thank you all for being here. We are so grateful that you've joined us tonight. Ron Stockton is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan Dearborn and a research associate at the University of Michigan Center for Middle East and North African Studies. He's a co-author of A Time of Turmoil, a book on public opinion, and the author of Decent and in Order, a book on conflict with religious organizations. He has a long-standing interest in the Arab American community and was one of two principal investigators on the Detroit Arab American Study, a landmark study of 1,016 Arab Americans and Chaldeans in Southeast Michigan. That project produced a team-authored book entitled Citizenship and Crisis, Arab Detroit After 9/11, in which he had two individually authored chapters. He teaches comparative non-Western politics, including a course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The curriculum he developed for this course has been used around the country. The university has awarded him its Distinguished Service Award, its Distinguished Teaching Award, and its Distinguished Research Award. He makes frequent media appearances. He has been on CNN with Anderson Cooper, CNN with Paula Zahn, Fox News with Brit Hume, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, PBS, IRN4 More from the UK, and Fars News from Iran. He is often heard on local radio and television and has written for the Detroit Free Press and Detroit News. He started a podcast series in February called Stockton After Class and has listeners in over 40 countries. Welcome, Ron. We are so grateful to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. It's up now to 82 countries. Isn't that amazing? And even one in Ulaanbaatar, Genghis Khan's hometown. So I'm really impressed by how these podcasts can spread around. When I was first asked to do this, the focus was on race, which I think is an appropriate thing because Hubbard's behavior in that regard was very important and very damaging. But I said, okay, let's change the title a little bit because this man was an amazing ruler. He was a very creative leader in many ways, in spite of his destructive behavior. So we have to include both of those to get a good balanced view of him. I want to talk about 4 different things, if I can work through them. Why Hubbard was so admired for his governance. What did he do, and why did people love him for that? There are still some old timers around who will tell you what a great mayor he was. I want to talk about his personal pathology. He was in constant battles and confrontations and lawsuits and litigation and pretty terrible things. We'll talk about his racism and his policies and controversies. And then I want to talk about the issue of statues. Hubbard's statue got very controversial, and my position evolved on that. So I'm going to be honest with you and tell you where I was and how I ended up. Hubbard was mayor for 36 years. He was elected in 1941, the first time, and suffered a stroke in 1974, I think it was, and was incapacitated. He's the longest serving mayor in the country. He ran for office 9 times before he finally got elected. And he ran for the state senate 3 times. He ran for mayor twice. He ran for city council. He ran for justice of the peace, and he ran for Congress. And he lost all of those. So it's a lesson, I guess, to people not to give up. When he was elected in 1941, Dearborn was under mob control. There had just been a grand jury that investigated criminal elements in the city, and they found a lot of activity. There were 80 bordellos, there were rackets, there were gangsters. The Klan was active. The Black Legion, which was a distinctly Michigan Klan-like organization. The chief of police was dirty and provided protection. And Hubbard got elected on the wave of that reform. So his original slogan, which he used, "Keep Dearborn Clean," originally said, "Keep Dearborn clean," let me find, "from vice, graft, and corruption." He later dropped the last part and just became "Keep Dearborn Clean," which had a totally different meaning in terms of race relations. Let me tell you what he achieved, why people loved this man. I'll tell you, he's a very creative, innovative leader in so many ways. It's interesting, he was a Republican, a very conservative Republican. He was a supporter of Taft in the 1952 Republican convention. Taft represented the right wing, the ultra-conservative wing. He was a Republican, but he was a socialist. He said, everything I've ever done is socialist. And so here you have someone who was probably to the left of Franklin Roosevelt, and yet he was a Republican and an anti-war activist. He introduced the very first resolution in the whole country renouncing the Vietnam War and calling for a pullout. Dearborn became the very first place that voted officially to end the war and to pull out. So he's hard to classify, but what you can say is that he was very innovative. Let me tell you some things he did. He purchased Camp Dearborn. In many of these cases, the city council and many people were against him. He went ahead and did it anyway. He purchased Camp Dearborn, which is very popular. He constructed senior housing, which was very unusual at that time. He strengthened and encouraged neighborhood associations. He said we have to have strong neighborhoods, and he encouraged neighborhoods to create neighborhood associations. And I was president of my neighborhood association for 2 years and was an officer for maybe 20. And every single time we met once a month, there was someone from one of the mayor's representatives sitting there in the corner taking notes. And if anybody said, look, these are good ideas, is the mayor going to learn about this? This was even after Hubbard was gone. He would say, I'm sitting here, I'm taking notes. I'm going to have a meeting with the mayor tomorrow morning, and I'm going to tell him about this. So that's the kind of thing, and people like that. He created a city building code, which was the strictest in the country. I had a colleague who got his doctorate in public policy in University of Iowa, and he said, it's amazing I'm here in Dearborn because when I was studying urban politics, we read the Dearborn Code. It was strict, and it was a model for how to maintain your city and keep it from deteriorating. He built neighborhood parks. He would tear down a house. He would often go in to these eyesore houses. He would declare them, to send in a building inspector, and they would find that there were 50 violations, and they would say, okay, you got a choice of doing $10,000 worth of repairs, or we'll give you $10,000 for the house. So they would sell the house, and then they would tear it down, and very often make that into what would they call tot lots, a little place where kids could play. These things were really popular. He proposed the consolidation of 15 neighboring communities into one, obviously under his leadership. And that would have been amazing for regional governance. It was very innovative. It didn't work out. He provided exceptionally high quality services. If anybody had a problem, they just call City Hall and they could go directly to the mayor. He had a rule that the phone would not ring twice. Anybody who let a phone ring twice was going to be in big trouble with the mayor. You answer immediately and you get back to people before the day is over. You never allow the sun to go down on an issue. And if someone said, I want to talk to the mayor, you could go right to the mayor. He would talk to you. He would shovel snow from sidewalks. This was still done when we came in. He would pave church parking lots. This was totally against the law. You can't use public monies for that, but he did it anyway. He said, okay, who's objecting? Nobody objected. He provided free babysitters for shoppers. He almost bought the Ambassador Bridge. Marty Maroon later bought it, but Dearborn almost owned that. Wouldn't that be interesting? He closed down all the alleys. They had alleys in between, and those places, people kept their cars there, and they were dirty, and criminals could come in, and they were really not good. So he closed those down and split them in half. So if you have a house in Dearborn, go out to the alley, half of it, about 7 or 8 feet of that. Beyond the last 7 or 8 feet of your property is not yours, really. It belongs to the city. Let's see, what else did he did? In terms of style, he was not a machine politician. He's been compared with Mayor Daley of Chicago from the 50s and 60s. No, he wasn't. Daley had an organization, and each of the ward healers was responsible for his own neighborhood and making sure everything was okay. That was not the way it worked. There was Orville Hubbard, and there were his flunkies. He had about 20 people who worked for him, and he treated them, he humiliated them. He paid them better than they would get if they quit. One person, he was just having fun with this person. He said, okay, get down on all fours and bark like a dog. So this head of a department had to do that. This was a Hubbard show. It was not, those people had no autonomy. They worked for the mayor and they had no choice. He was the center of everything. He provided amazing personal service. If one of those neighborhood associations said, there's a pothole, that would be reported to the mayor and it would be fixed. So different people are always complaining today about the roads. The roads weren't this way when Mayor Hubbard was in charge. That's a fact. They were not. Hubbard fixed things. Complaints were answered. By the way, when I was in Southern Illinois University, getting ready to go to Michigan State, where I was going to do my doctorate, we had someone who was from Dearborn, and he worked for the university. And Jane and I were talking to him one day, and he said, "Oh, you're going to Michigan?" He says, "I'm from Dearborn." Well, that's not where I was going. I was going to East Lansing. But he said, the mayor there, he's an amazing person. He said one day he told me this story. I've heard this story multiple times. He got a call from someone and said, they missed my garbage. The garbage collectors missed my garbage. He says, "Okay, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it." And so he got in his car, had his flunky drive him down, took a bag with him, put the garbage into the bag, threw it into the back of the car, drove back to City Hall, went into the public service director's office and dumped it on the man's desk and said, "You missed Mr. De Silva's pickup today. Don't let that happen again or you'll be unemployed." Now, I don't know if that was true or not, but the public loves that kind of thing. They want someone who's on their side. At the same time, there was something very destructive about this man. I'll tell you some terms I've read about him. And by the way, today I went through and reread this book, it's backwards, but it's called Orville, the Dictator of Dearborn. And it's written by a friend of mine, Dave Good, who worked for the Detroit News back when they had a magazine. He was the deputy editor of the Weekend magazine. And this book is just wonderful. If you're interested in Orville Hubbard, you can buy this on the internet for a cheap price. Some of these terms I'm going to use here, and a few that I've just heard elsewhere. He was a sadistic martinet. Martinet means like a military person. He was a miniature Mussolini. He was a tyrant, a monster. He used physical and mental abuse to control people, and was especially cruel to those around him and close to him. He engaged in nonstop vituperation of his opponents, attacking anybody who questioned him in any way with vile personal attacks. Have we seen anything like this in recent years? I don't know. When his wife tried to get a legal protective order so that he would stop abusing her, here's what he said. I knocked her around on her ass. That settled a couple of things. That's kind of the way. She divorced him, by the way. She divorced him once. She started the divorce and he beat her up, and she dropped the divorce. And then she did it a second time for good. There was a Jekyll and Hyde personality here. If you crossed him in any way, he was a monster. But if you just bumped into him, he was charming and affable and your best friend. And I don't know. It was like there were really two persons in there. He was constantly surrounded with conflict and turmoil throughout his whole 36 years. He had a history of disputes, investigations, motions of censure. He attacked people, they attacked him. He had endless bouts of litigation based on whim. He often just sued people because they disagreed with him. And again, have we heard any of this? He fought his political opponents. He fought his own department heads, city employees. He fought the Ford Motor Company, which had backed him for a while because they thought he would clean up the city, which he did. There were grand juries and anyone who got in his way. His neighborhoods who crossed him by voting the wrong way. When your precinct went the wrong way, the precinct often didn't have garbage picked up. You just had to deal with that yourself. He started to level the South End, Dearborn South End neighborhood, which is an ethnic neighborhood today, mostly a Yemeni neighborhood. He would go in, as I mentioned, he would go in and send an inspector in and declare that there were 50 violations, and you have to have these fixed within 3 months or we'll repossess. And then they would say, okay, but we'll buy this property if you just want to leave. So most of the people who left just moved to another house. But there was a lawsuit by people who said, you're going to dismantle this neighborhood. And this is an ethnic neighborhood with a heritage. It's got an Arab heritage now, and we want to save it. And a federal judge agreed. And once I interviewed Hubbard, I didn't, but one of our classes did. And he said, some judge, he said, that neighborhood should be closed down. He said, that is a terrible neighborhood. He said, the pollution there is so bad that the kids can't go out to play from school, which is true. And he said, it's not safe to live in that neighborhood. And he said that should be leveled and used for industrial development. We could create a new neighborhood somewhere else. It was interesting to see him. He was totally defiant. He never compromised on anything. He never changed his position on anything as far as I can tell. There was a recall motion against him in 1951. And everyone who signed that recall motion, he kept a permanent list. The motion was defeated. The only neighborhoods the only regions that part of the city that voted for him were in East Dearborn. He says, I'm standing up for poor people, and you got a bunch of rich people over there in northwest Dearborn, and they've got fancy cars, and their kids have fancy schools and fancy education, and they go to fancy universities, and they don't care about the rest of you, but I am not going to put up with that. I mean, the average person loved that, and he kept that list. And from then on, he had a secretary who was in charge of that list. And anybody who ever called him with an issue, the secretary would immediately as the phone was being handed to the mayor, would say, he's okay, or he's on the list. And Hubbard would say, you know, I'm just sitting here with this list. You signed, you're asking me for a favor now. You're asking me to help you with your neighborhood. And you were one of those people who signed that petition. And I just wonder, how can you be so shameless as to do this? And usually these people would grovel, you know, and then he would say, okay, let's forget this. Then we can move past this as long as you're sorry you did it. But you had to tell him you were sorry, and you had to officially ask that your name be taken off the list. And if you did that, one of his bitter opponents, he actually reconciled with him and made him into one of his officials, put him in as department head of something. Let's see, how are we doing? Just a minute. What do I want to say here before? On race issues, let's talk about some race issues. I don't think Hubbard was probably more racist than anyone else before it became something where you could win votes. And then he changed. The first issue that raised this, Dearborn, of course, is all white. It was at the time anyway. In 1948, there was a proposal to create a federal low-income housing project in Dearborn. This would have brought in 1,200 families. And it could have expanded to 14,000, to 45,000. It was in Springwells, which is an old name for East Dearborn. And it was on Ford land. And Ford was in favor of this because they were going to be able to sell their land and make a lot of money. And the city council was in favor of it because it was going to give them a lot of extra tax revenue. Everybody was in favor of it. But Hubbard said, you know what you're going to do? You're going to bring in black people. He didn't use that word. You're going to bring in black people, and you're going to bring in poor people, and Dearborn is going to be a different place, and you do not want to live in that place. And so he put this on a ballot as an advisory issue. And that's one of those things where it just escalated. And of course, it passed very strongly. That is, defeat the idea of creating this neighborhood, a low income housing, was defeated overwhelmingly. And Hubbard was then the person who had stood up for the poor, the common people of Dearborn, and for the city against those specialized elites who would have done whatever they were going to do. In 1963, there was a horrendous incident that happened, Kendall Street. The Kendall Street riot. It was Labor Day. There was a Labor Day weekend. There was a man who owned a house there, and he was moving in some things, and he hired someone who was his worker, someone he knew, an African-American, a black guy, and his wife. And he said, I'll pay you and you help me move these things into this house. So the neighbors looked up and they saw a black man with a pregnant wife, and they were moving furniture into a house. And suddenly everything exploded. They began, the neighbors, a mob gathered. That's all you can say. A mob gathered. They began smashing out the windows. The owner was inside, and he said to them, you know, I got a weapon, don't threaten me. And the police, you can imagine that might happen in that environment of 1963. But the police, what they did was they parked police cars there, and they did nothing to stop the mob. Their instructions were, make sure they don't damage other houses in the neighborhood. They did nothing. This riot went on for over a day. I've forgotten exactly how long. Nobody was ever prosecuted, none of the neighbors, but Hubbard was charged with negligence and negligent supervision and retention, whatever that legal term is. He was charged with that and ultimately found not guilty. And one of the jurors was an African-American. And when it was over, Hubbard said, I want to take all the jury out and celebrate. And he went up specifically to this man and said, would you like to come with us. And the man said, no, I'm sorry, I got something else planned. So, and later this man was interviewed and he said, look, it was a matter of law. That was it. I couldn't find the evidence to indicate that the mayor had been involved in this. Well, he was the mayor. He said, I wasn't even in town. I was visiting somewhere. Anyway, that's the Kendall Street massacre, not massacre, riot. In 1956, when the demonstrations were going on in Montgomery, Martin Luther King, you know all about that. Rosa Parks, you know all about that. White people in the South were getting feeling put upon because they said, you know, there's so much racism in the North. Why are you focusing on us? You got as much racism in the North. So they sent someone up. They sent their ace reporter up to Dearborn and interviewed Orville Hubbard. And they asked him, what do you think about all this racial stuff? And he says, this is terrible. These are rioters, they're demonstrators, you know, you should lock them up, whatever. And he said, he is in favor of complete segregation, 1,000,000%. That kind of got him a reputation nationwide if he didn't have it outside of Michigan. The first year I was on campus, a group of our students went down to interview him. They were student interns. And so they went down to interview him. And we came in and we were all sitting there waiting. The meeting was late, no problem. And one of his staff came out, one of his directors came out and said, oh, you're really lucky. He's in a good mood today. And we wondered what the alternative was. But so we went in and we sat down and there was a long table there and we lined up around the table. I was over at the side. I let the students sit at the table. I was just a guest. And they had a very interesting interview. And finally, one of the young women, we only had one person there was an African-American. And Hubbard was at one end of the table. She was at the exact opposite. So he kind of looked down and she said to him, Mayor, you're such a charismatic man. Couldn't you do something to like reduce race tensions in this city and maybe help integrate the city and solve some problems? So he leaned over and he squinted and he said, you're black, aren't you? She said, well, yes, Mayor, I am. I admire this student so much. She was never my student. If she was, I would have given her an A+ just for being poised. But anyway, she said, well, yes, I am. And he said, well, not that it matters to me. When I was in the Caribbean in the Marines, I had me some black girlfriends. And I thought, wow, what a statement to make to this young woman. I mean, here she is, she's 19, you know, and he's talking this way to her. And then he said, we don't discriminate in the city of Dearborn. If someone wants to buy a house, so you go to any of our real estate offices, you're going to see flyers there which say, we're not allowed to discriminate. This is a prohibition of state and national law. I can tell you those flyers were there. I've seen them because I bought a house there. And so I know they were there. And he said, we don't discriminate. He said, but smart people live where they're wanted. And I think he kind of left the message. I want to talk a little bit about statues. There are two reasons to have statues. One is that they are memorials, and one is commemoration. A memorial is to something wonderful that you're proud of. Like Dr. Salk invented a way of curing polio. He deserves a statue. I don't know if he has one, but he should have 50 of them. And that's something that you want to remember. The other is a commemoration. It's something so awful that you don't want to forget that this happened. Maybe you could have a monument to the removal of the Cherokees, or a monument to slavery. We now have a lynching museum in the South We've never had anything like that. Still, after all of these years, we do not have a slavery museum in Washington, D.C. Why don't we have a slavery museum in Washington, D.C.? We need something to remind us of what awful things happened in the past, so we can't be allowed to forget those things. When Hubbard died, he had a stroke and was incapacitated and finished out his term. But as soon as he died, soon thereafter, some of his admirers put up a statue of him in front of City Hall. And it was, some of you have seen it, you know, his hand is out like this. And someone said, you know what he's doing? He's pointing to Detroit. And he was saying, just keep moving, don't slow down. But I think that was a cynical perspective. But nevertheless, there's that statue. And okay, my position has evolved on this, or at least my stated position. When Dave Good's book came out, this one I just mentioned, when that book came out, I was asked to do a review of it for the Detroit News. So I did a very nice review. It was very good. And in there, I listed all the amazingly good things that Hubbard had done. And I said, for these reasons alone, he deserves that statue. But I said his leadership was poisoned by the racism that did so much harm. I think that's a position that I wish I hadn't written that down, but at the same time, I am consistent in what I think. I think if you put up a statue to Robert E. Lee sitting on his horse with a saber, what you know is that if that man had been successful, slavery would have continued in this country and the United States would no longer exist. As far as I'm concerned, you can tear that darn statue down. But if you have a statue of Robert E. Lee in a business suit, standing with a piece of paper in his hand, i.e. the charter of a university, I think that man deserves the Washington Lee University, of which he was one of the founders. I think putting up a statue to that man is good because he was doing something which was advancing the welfare of society. Even though he had done something else that I hate, he did something good. Draw that distinction. So what do you do with a statue of Hubbard at a time of Black Lives Matter? Suddenly people were saying, okay, this is a man who stayed in power for 36 years, very often because he was able to play racial tensions up. And so what do you do with that? So I wrote an article that was in the Dearborn Historian, and I said, you know, it needs to be moved to the historical museum. We got a museum there, move it over there. And then they did the wrong thing, in my opinion. They stuck it in front. They should have put the darn thing where you drive by, you can't avoid it. They should have stuck it at the side. That would have been appropriate, maybe facing away or something. And then there was a talk about, you know, it shouldn't even be out there. And I said, okay, I shifted my position slightly. I said, okay, you know what really should be done? They should move that thing inside and they should have an exhibit on the history of racism in Dearborn and including the good things that Orville Hubbard did and the things he did of which we should be ashamed. Well, that never worked because for one thing, they said that statue is so big, it would knock the whole, go right through the floor. There's no way we can have that inside. Plus someone came out one night and put a Black Lives Matter sweater over Hubbard. And at this point, his family, I assume that's his daughter, said, okay, we're taking charge of this. And nobody knew who owned it or who gave permission. But anyway, we woke up one morning and that was gone. Just a minute, I got a couple things to tell you. People have said, who do we compare this person with? Are there any other leaders comparable? Well, he was a populist, but I call him a pathological populism. It was populism means you're supporting the interests of common people against the ruling elite. He sort of did that, but it was a pathological populism. It was unhealthy. There was something really unhealthy about that. And so people have said, what about Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana in the 1930s? He was a populist. He supported the common people. He did a lot of good. There's no question about that. He was very personalist. He ran a personal governorship. He was very abusive, but he delivered services. Okay, that's a reasonable comparison with Huey Long. Mussolini was a dictator, but he delivered. He really did. So the trains ran on time. If they didn't run on time, he would have you arrested and locked up. And he did a lot of other things. He locked a lot of people up for criticizing him, but nevertheless, he did some things. Donald Trump was personalist. He could never figure out how to deliver on his policies. He never figured out how to make the system work. He created, he was disruptive, he was divisive, he was abusive, but he was not transformative. He did not change the country. He changed our culture. You know, we yell at each other more now than we did, but he didn't change the country. And he could not figure out how to get reelected. At least Hubbard could figure out how to get reelected all of those many times. I'll give you one last story and then I'll take questions. As Hubbard was dying in the last year of his life, the Washington Post, which then had an absolutely wonderful weekend news magazine, sent out one of their ace reporters, and he interviewed me because I'd written a book on Dearborn. So he interviewed me. So he came into my living room. He sat down for an hour. We sat there. I told him everything I could think of. I told him data. I told him anecdotes. I gave him insights. He made notes, just the way a good reporter would do. And he said, well, thank you very much. This is very valuable. And as we were leaving, Jane sat there quietly the whole time. As we were leaving, she said, you know what? I think he's very close to death. But if he dies, they're just going to stuff him and run him for re-election. They won't even acknowledge that he died. Well, that's a very clever comment. But to me, what's interesting is the man didn't bother to quote me, but he quoted Jane. So this was her first appearance, and only appearance, I guess, in a Washington Post. So congratulations, Jane. So whatever questions there are, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Ron. We really appreciate that wonderful, informative information that you gave us. We're going to open it up to gallery view here for everybody. And so if you'd like to ask a question, there's you can write it in the chat, or you can kind of do the hand raise thing and we can call on you. Lorelei, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I will. Ron, in your podcast about Orville Hubbard, I thought it was really interesting, the anecdote about putting up the image of African Americans being criminals, and that someone took him to court and
Yes.
the judge said something. Can you relay that story?
Yeah, you know, he was charged so many times with racial abuse and whatever. He was only convicted once. And that was because of his bulletin board. He had in City Hall, I've seen this, by the way, it's taken down now, thank goodness. But if you went back during that time, there was a bulletin board as you came into the mayor's office. There was apparently another one in the police station, but I never saw that one. But I can attest to the fact of the one in the mayor's office. And he instructed his staff to find stories in the news about bad stories about Black people. So, you know, Black person robs store, Black person mugs old lady, Black person kills his wife, Black person, you know, does this and that. What's really interesting is that every single one of those stories was factual. None of them were made up. But what the Civil Rights Commission declared was that collectively they created an imbalanced perspective on Black people. Now, this is interesting to me, and this is being sponsored by a Presbyterian church. This is interesting to me because the official Presbyterian teaching on thou shalt not bear false witness is that if you emphasize all the bad things about a person and portray that as being the person, you have engaged in false witness. That is, simply telling all the bad things about someone is false, even if they're all true. There's a similar teaching, by the way, in Islam, where the Prophet Muhammad says, what do you do with a person who's actually done a bad thing? Well, you try to get him to do a good thing, but don't focus entirely on the bad thing. And I thought that was really interesting. They actually handed down a ruling against Hubbard for this. And there's a story. Of course, he defied everything. He never accepted anyone who criticized him. He just he could just turn it on them and say, well, you're worse, you know. But I thought for myself that that's a really revealing story of Hubbard's mayorship.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience here? Yes, looks like Carol and Ben Hilkema. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Are we unmuted?
Yep.
Yeah, we used to live about a half a mile north of Ford Woods Park. And one thing that the mayor did run, the garbage men were hired. They weren't city workers. They were hired, or no, they were city workers.
Right.
And they wanted time off for lunch to clean their hands. And as I recall, he told them, you don't have to wash your hands before. Use your sandwich bag so you don't touch your food. And that started a garbage strike. And I remember we were 2 blocks away from a big stinky mess because they took it all to the park and dumped it. And that finally ended. I don't know if anybody
did he negotiate with them? Do you remember?
I don't know the date.
Or he said, did they negotiate with him?
Oh, I think they must have finally negotiated. Yeah.
Yeah, they worked it out somehow.
Yeah, he couldn't win that one.
He was not a reasonable person.
No.
No.
Ron, I've got a question for you in the chat from Byron. An infamous slogan of Hubbard was "Keep Dearborn Clean," which sadly translated as "Keep Dearborn White." Do you believe that the impact of this slogan still affects the city of Dearborn? And if so, how? And another question, has there been any actions or statements by Dearborn officially to separate or amend from said slogan of the past?
Wait a minute. Where's my notes? That originally said "Keep Dearborn clean from vice, corruption, and something else I've forgotten." But then after he realized there was an advantage to just dropping the vice and corruption, since he had been mayor a couple times, he shifted it to "Keep Dearborn clean," and the whole tone of it became obviously a slogan that everybody understood. If you would ask him, he would say, it's just we want to keep the city clean. That doesn't have anything to do with race. Everybody wants a clean city, which was disingenuous, I would say. But I have taken a position on this. I've sent a letter to Mayor O'Reilly at one point, and to my favorite members of the city council. And I said I thought Dearborn should back in 2016, I think it was, or 15, when there was all the bad racial tensions occurring. And I said I thought Dearborn really should separate itself from this. They should issue a statement saying they don't accept this and they think that it did harm. And individuals have said those things, but the city has never taken an official statement, and I think they should have. If anybody today believes that, then they just haven't walked around in the neighborhood anymore, because probably 45% or so of the population of Dearborn are people of Arab heritage. And so anybody who thinks this is a white city is just, I would say, living in the 50s. That's not bad living in the 50s, but you're not in touch with reality.
Ron, another question. There have been several of, or at least one that I know of, Hubbard's relatives that have also held various offices in Dearborn. Did they do anything to try to distinguish themselves from the racism that he spread, or did they just ignore that part and try to go off of the fame of the name? Do you have any comments on that?
He had a difficult relationship with his children. I mean, it was a martinet. I mean, that's the term, like for a person who behaves like the worst sergeant, you know. So some of his kids separated themselves from him, and he abused their mother. So some separated themselves. Some tried to reconcile themselves with their father, and so we had people on the city council, and one of his sons became the clerk. City clerk, and one was on the Susan Hubbard was on the city council. And so I would say, have moved away from it. What Susan's position is that her father was someone who got along with Black people. He made a lot of intemperate statements. She doesn't identify with those statements. I hope I'm characterizing her correctly. But that this was not the single defining dimension of his life. She would say what I would say about anybody, that we've got to look at the different dimensions of someone. I would say his kids have tried, without renouncing their father, they have tried to create a separate course, which allowed them to work with people different from people of white heritage. So I don't know. I'm reluctant to go too far on that because I don't know, but I think they have not specifically renounced their father, but they've separated themselves and redefined themselves in a different way.
Thank you. Another question, do you have any comments on the relationship between Hubbard and Coleman Young?
Oh, well, that's very interesting.
Mm.
We had a man named Dick Austin, who was one of the most popular. We had Frank Kelly and Dick Austin. These were two Democrats, and one was Secretary of State and one was Attorney General. Kelly was the Attorney General and Dick Austin was Secretary of State. And at one point, Dick Austin ran for mayor of Detroit and against a white chief of police. And Hubbard endorsed him. He surprised everyone by endorsing the Black guy. And but Austin was really good. He would have been a good mayor. He did not win. Regarding Coleman Young, this is really interesting because he and Young actually were friends. And I don't know what you mean by friends under these circumstances, but they interacted with each other. They visited with each other. They talked with each other. And Coleman Young, when he was running for mayor the first time, they said, "What kind of a mayor would you like to be?" And he said, "I would like to be like Orville Hubbard." And people were shocked. They said, "Don't you know this guy's a racist?" They said, "Yeah, but he runs the city in a really good way, and he looks out for the neighborhoods." And I mean, it was really totally unpredictable that Coleman Young would basically say his model is Orville Hubbard. Maybe he just thought, okay, if I can swing 10,000 white votes, it may make a difference. But nevertheless, they had a very interesting relationship.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up one more time and see if there are any final questions for Ron. You can raise your hand or you can unmute yourself. I think that's all the questions that we have. Oh, you know what? Wait. Go ahead, Fran.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay.
Who's this?
Fran Hayes.
Oh, hello, Fran.
Hi. I finally remembered that. I don't know when Zoom is going to recognize I'm who I am instead of somebody from First Presbyterian, but anyway, I've heard some things about, some of the things that Hubbard was able to do in terms of some of the building and some of the infrastructure kinds of things had to do with the way the city taxed like Ford Motor Company, and that there ended up being an adversarial relationship in a lot of ways. That at some point, Ford was, even when they would relocate people here for big positions, they'd say, don't live in Dearborn. So that, I don't know how much you know about that in terms of how much of the wonderful stuff he was able to do administratively because of the taxation system, and really put the screws to Ford Motor, apparently, in a lot of ways.
I would that's absolutely true. Ford Motor Company paid, I think, 70% or more of all Dearborn taxes. And you think about it, probably the biggest factory in the world is sitting right here in Dearborn, and the world headquarters. That's a lot of property. And at a certain point, Ford hired a tax manager, and said, okay, try to figure out how to reduce our taxes. So they began reducing it. And this, in the 80s, this created real problems for the city of Dearborn. All of those nice services that Dearborn used to do, like cleaning the snow, shoveling the snow, and maintaining the roads and all that sort of stuff, those things basically got shorted because of the reduction of revenue from Ford Motor Company, and it created some tension. When my students interviewed Hubbard, he said, all we ask is that as you drive past the world headquarters, you genuflect. And I was making a joke, but we get along with Ford, and they give us a lot of money, and we do what, we're able to do things. So that absolutely happened. It happened. Probably the big impact was in the 80s when we began to see the money dry up and our taxes went up. And yeah, Jane and I lived through that, and some others, Ben and Carol, probably did too. But things began to change then. So that's absolutely true. I'm glad you mentioned that. By the way, are we out of time?
We got one more question, Ron.
Oh, okay. Because I want to read to you something that Dave Good wrote as kind of a final 15-second
Perfect.
farewell.
Yeah. Let me ask you one final question, and then definitely you can read that. So Ruth says she's heard that Hubbard told City Council how to vote. If he supported it, it would pass, and if not, it wouldn't. Can you confirm that? Is that something that you're familiar with?
Yes. When Hubbard got elected the first time in 1941, he had a very hostile city council. And in those days, an appointment, like if he wanted to appoint someone who's the garbage collector, that person had to be approved by the city council. He didn't. It's a weak mayor. It's called mayor council governance, and it's the mayor really was not an independent person. So for the first 500 appointments he made, he didn't get one single one approved. So what he did was change the charter so that now the mayor can appoint someone. This is called a strong mayor model. The mayor can appoint someone, and if the city council doesn't like it, too bad. The second thing was how to get that council to stop fighting him on every single issue. So what he did, which I think worked reasonably well, he created a Hubbard slate. He would come up with a list of candidates and say, these candidates have promised to work with me, not against me, if they will get elected. So usually with a 7-person city council, usually Hubbard had 4 or 5 of those people who were on his slate. Sometimes he had 6. Once he had 6 members of the council who were on his slate. These people weren't necessarily puppets. They didn't just do what he said, but they worked with him instead of against him. And so if someone says, when Hubbard said something, he probably got support for that, that's probably true. And in fact, when Mayor Guido was mayor, some of you remember Mayor Guido, he had a similar situation. There was a time when the city council, several members of the city council were so awful, they would insult citizens. You know, people would come and make an expression of concern or criticize some service. And, you know, you're supposed to sit there and listen to these people. They're your employees. And you're supposed to listen to them and pay attention. Maybe they can teach you something. And these people would yell at the citizens who came forward. And it was pretty awful. And Guido came up with a slate. And he said, okay, these people are going to be polite to citizens and they're going to work together with us, not against us. And that worked. I think several members of the city council got defeated next time around. I don't remember the names and I wouldn't say them anyway. But I've got a couple in my mind that I can remember. One woman in particular was awful and she was defeated. But anyway, I think there's a little bit of truth in that Hubbard had his followers on the city council and he could come up with a position and they would support him, but not always. A lot of times they opposed him on various, even his slate would break with him.
Thanks, Ron. I'm going to throw one more question your way because I saw we have a question from Facebook from Jennifer, and you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could elaborate. Was there resistance to Hubbard from within the city, or was his policy and style generally accepted by residents?
Oh, there was a lot of resistance. That's why you had the recall petition in 1941, and sorry, in 1951, and there were people contacting the state because the governor has the power to remove a mayor, as the people of Detroit learned. You can remove someone, and so there was a lot of resistance. There were organized efforts. A lot of ministers were opposed to him. They formed they formed citizens groups for better government. They had names like that, and that happened before I was in the city. So I don't know. I can't tell you much about those ministers. I know the minister of Cherry Hill Presbyterian was active. I never knew that minister. There were some priests that were involved. Some members of congregations were involved. So there was a lot of resistance, and Hubbard fought those people, and would take retaliation against them.
All right, thank you, Ron. If you would like to go ahead and read your final.
Read my final statement.
Yeah.
Well, Hubbard wanted to run for Congress. He got antsy in Dearborn. I mean, he's a big fish in a little pond, you know, and so he kept looking around for things other positions that would. He didn't make a lot of money either. It's amazing. He was never a wealthy person. He never had a big house or anything like that. He considered a run for Congress. He applied for the job as city manager of Madison, Wisconsin. I hate to think about that. He was a finalist, I guess, as the city manager of Grand Rapids. He ran for circuit court. First 18 gets elected. He didn't make it. He came in 21st. And he just didn't seem able to break out of this city. A man with such amazing creativity and vision, but he couldn't break out. And here's what Dave Good writes. He says, the tragedy of Orville Hubbard was not that he turned out to be a racist or a dictator or a petty self-aggrandizing egoist. it was that those traits condemned him to 36 years in Dearborn City Hall instead of permitting him to move on to higher office. In a very real sense, Hubbard's long mayoral tenure was not his glory, but his badge of mediocrity. It's like a Greek tragic hero. The thing that makes you successful is the thing that destroys you. And Hubbard was that way. He spent his whole career in this one little town. He could never break out of this town. If he had been a different type of person, not a racist, not a dictator, not a demagogue, he would have ended up in Congress. He would have ended up in the state legislature. He might have ended up as governor, who knows? But he destroyed himself with some of those qualities. It's why our past president could not get himself reelected. He damaged his own credibility. Okay, did I reveal a position? Yeah, okay, wait here. Why do you use these qualities? Why did these qualities go over so well? I think he had his little base. I just saw the question down there, if that's okay.
Sure.
Why did these qualities go so?
Let me read that for everyone.
Yeah, please do go ahead.
From Beth, why do you think those qualities went over so well in Dearborn, but not the rest of the state?
You know, I think human beings are very complex, and they have a mix of motivations. And Hubbard provided I mean, everybody could look around and see a city that was badly governed, or where bad things had happened, or a neighborhood where once everything had been nice and now 25 years later it wasn't nice. They could see that. And Hubbard said, that's not going to happen here. I'm going to keep raising the quality. And people said, that's good. What do you want from your city? You want them to pick up the garbage on time. You want them to keep taxes as low as possible. You want them to keep corruption under control. That's about all you want. You want to keep the streets safe. Okay, if you got that, you could kind of go crazy if you want on some other issues. I think that was why it was. I don't think we should assume in his last election, Hubbard got 93% of the vote. That was about 4 or 5 months before I moved to Dearborn. So I missed the opportunity to be a part of the 9% that voted against him. But if you look at the 93%, not all of those people were racists. Not all of them were dictators. They had a mix of motives. I don't want to excuse anyone, but at the same time, I just want to say, if we recognize that human beings are really complex and life is complex and nothing is as simple as it seems, we're going to be able to get a lot more insight out of the way political systems function and the way human beings behave.
I think that's a great thought to end on, Ron. Great thing to ponder. Thank you so much for your wealth of knowledge on this topic. And I'm sure we could have asked a lot more questions and had you speak a lot more. I know you had to condense your original presentation down for us here. So thank you for doing that. And I just want to lift up, if you are interested in hearing more from Ron, then you can Google, search his podcast, Stockton After Class, and you'll see here listed a bunch of podcasts that he's already done. And I know there are more to come. Some of them can be found on Apple and Audible, but you can also search for it and listen to a lot of these great and enlightening topics. Ron, did you have anything to add about your podcast?
No, except I have a download in Ulaanbaatar, which is Genghis Khan's hometown. I'm not sure who in Mongolia is checking in on me, but I really appreciate it and I wish them well.
I think they probably downloaded that Rules of Good Studenting one, I think.
I hope so. Yeah, that would be a good one. Yeah. By the way, you were very nice to give me a little stipend for this. And I told you I was going to give it away. I've donated it to a group that supports. I've donated to Zaman, which is a group that run by Naja Bazi, and their support. They've got a program in Gaza. So I thought, okay, I'd be happy to contribute this to that worthy cause.
Excuse me, you donated the money to Middle Eastern Children's something or other.
Yeah, well, we
To
got.
Gaza.
Okay, never mind. I should check with my tech support before I make any statement.
Your tech support, your PR person, your secretary, your all
Yeah.
of
Well,
Go ahead, Laura.
since we are Littlefield Action for Social Justice, I want to remind everybody how important it is to study up on the candidates for local elections and vote. We have two very important elections coming up this year. One is the primary on August 3rd. The other is the general election on November 2nd. There are two races that are worthy of your attention. One is the mayoral race, and the other is the Dearborn City Council. We will elect a new mayor this year. There are 7 candidates who are running. In the primary election, you will choose your favorite, and the 2 that get the most votes will move on to the general election, and we'll choose between the 2 of them. So typically, local elections only have maybe a 20% turnout. So your vote will make a really big impact. So don't forget to vote in the primary because your favorite might not make it to the general. Likewise, for Dearborn City Council, there are 17 candidates and there are 7 seats on council. You'll pick 7 out of 17. The top 14 vote getters will move on to the general election. Again, you'll select your 7 to represent you. And I want to let everyone know that a really excellent source of information on candidates is the League of Women Voters from Dearborn and Dearborn Heights. They have online resources at vote411.org. They also have voter guides, and we'll be having forums where all the candidates will be present to answer questions spontaneously. And it gets a really good indication of people's personalities and their views. So please study the ballot and make an informed choice on August 3rd and November 2nd. If you're going to be out of town or want to vote from the luxury of your home, please request an absentee ballot for one or both of those elections. So I'll hand it back over to you, Anna. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And we also thank you for sticking around a couple extra minutes here. We just want to tell you about some upcoming things for Littlefield Action for Social Justice and Littlefield Church in general. We typically do a cereal for summer drive, and this is also part of the action in our name and our very mission-oriented church. That we collect cereal, boxes of cereal for summer for families who are food insecure. Cereal is a great thing to be able to donate because it is affordable for those of us who can, and it lasts a long time on the shelf, and it can feed a lot of people. So if you're interested in picking up an extra box the next time that you're at the store, you can contact us and we will get that from you during the month of June. Also, you may be aware of how Star Commonwealth is housing over 200 plus migrant children, all boys, from the border of US and Mexico. They have an Amazon wish list for things to try to make their stay easier. Some things include tennis shoes, sweatshirts, things like that. Other things are art and craft supplies or board games and things. So if you're interested in contributing to that, then I can put the link in the chat, or you can contact me and I will send that to you. And also, one of the things that Littlefield does, we have a book group called Engage Book Group that reads a lot of social justice related books, some both fiction and nonfiction, and that meets about every month or two. And then we have our Engage movie group, which discusses social justice related films. And our movie for the month of June is Birth of a Nation, the 2016 version. So if you'd like to watch that on your own and then meet us for an hour of discussion on Zoom, then contact us or through the email or personally through the chat, and we can hook you up with the link for that. So once again, we just want to thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Dr. Ron Stockton for your expertise on this and for providing really great insight for us on the city of Dearborn. We appreciate all of your time this evening.